Anne, welcome to the Femsplainers.
So happy to be here with you. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, I have been watching the series Mrs. America. I met your mother a few times, and I'll tell you, I was talking about this in the intro. We introduced you in the intro, so I talked about your mom. And the series, it seems like it kind of wants to tell some truth about how incredible your mother was and, effective and brilliant. And it wants to reveal the failings of the feminists as well. On the other hand, and it does that beautifully, but most of the time, it's just inventing stories to slam her. And
Yes,
so they try to show that she's great, but then they show she's a duplicitous sister-in-law. She's a bad mother. She's an oppressed wife, and she's I mean, it's almost, and they made it up. She
they
made
did.
these things up.
I think they can't figure out, they sort of at times call her intelligent, but then they show her as a puppet of my father, a puppet of other men, and it's like they can't get the story quite right.
Well, I
What
think they don't understand the story. It's just too
Well, they
far
don't want to
outside
give
their,
credit to a woman who bested them.
yeah.
That she must have been coached or led by somebody else. Surely she couldn't have done it on her own.
Well,
I felt like that. Oh, can
yeah, go
I?
ahead. No, you go ahead.
This is Caitlin. I felt the moment when I felt, oh, the tell for the makers of the series that, oh, they really hate this person, and they're finding ways to really admire her, but what she's talking about, they hate so much. And I felt that was in the scene where she'd had this really long day, and then her husband wanted to have sex with her, and it was
Oh,
like, and it was sort of like not negotiable. It was like, oh, I don't, I'm tired. I want to, well, no, that's fine. We'll do it when you're tired. And I thought, oh, so they just want her to be a surrendered wife who just has to, even after a long day, the wifely duty. And I thought, okay, it's pretty clear what side they're on.
I don't know
And
that
you
Anne
saw the
could,
look of contempt that Cate Blanchett had towards her husband in that scene.
right.
Yes.
well, tell us, Anne. I mean, I thought, Caitlin, that was bold to suggest that Anne would tell us about the sexual dynamics of her parents' marriage. But
Nobody
they
wants
No,
to
I was
think
really,
only,
about
that
that.
was,
Nobody wants to think about that.
but they really had a loving marriage. It
tell us
was a
about
love match, and they were, I mean, they were much more two peas in a pod than they were this power game that they're showing.
Well, he loved her, and the way they met was, I just thought, so revealing that he read some high-powered argument about, I don't know, nuclear strategy or something, and he thought, I got to meet this writer, assuming it was a man, and then it was this beautiful woman. And he said, I fell in love with her mind, and it was love at first sight sort of thing. And every time I looked at a lot of videos I could find online when I saw them together, they were equals. They'd met one another's match. I mean, and you grew up with that. So
Mhm.
so what?
Yes,
And
and
it
they
showed.
very much, and it's important that to remember that my father supported my mother intellectually, spiritually, emotionally, and financially. They were
mm,
fully a team. They enjoyed debating the issues of the day back and forth. And the idea that my father was, didn't want her to go out in public or didn't want to run for office, actually, they missed his humor. He had a great deal of humor. And he used to like to say, I regret that I have but one wife to give to my country.
one of the things that
And
I
he was
found,
called. He
very
sometimes
funny.
would introduce himself as Mrs. Schlafly. He
No,
thought it was.
Mr. Phyllis.
I mean, Mr. Phyllis.
And he
Yeah.
enjoyed being called Mr. Phyllis.
Yes.
It's something,
Yes.
I think for the feminist producers of this show, the problem is that my parents had a marriage that they envied, so they had to trash it.
Yeah.
one of the interesting things, and I thought I have not come away from the show with such a negative image of your mom. I think that they're trying to, inevitably, in some ways, she has to be a character representing a side in addition to who she was, as opposed to a
Mhm.
straight biopic. One of the things that I found interesting, I'd love to hear what you would have to say, is, and this comes from the first episode, there's a depiction of her embracing the anti-ERA cause, or so-called women's issues, even though she was a very accomplished, she and actually your dad wrote together a very significant paper um, for the American Bar Association, I think,
Yes.
that had transformative impact on
Mhm.
defense. You can correct me, but she was a defense and missile specialist, and early on in the series they show her in a room with congressmen, and they keep kind of, yeah, thank you, Phyllis, and what we would today call kind of silencing her
They told her to take notes.
or take notes, and then and
That's an
and
invention.
and
She
then
got that
she
from a footnote she misunderstood, but
and
never.
then according to the series she kind of latched on to the ERA/women's issues because that's where she could get taken seriously as a woman within the Republican circles that she was in. Is that
Yeah,
accurate at all?
no, their point is to show her as power mad, that she was an opportunist. That is what they want to show in this. But I think what that fundamentally misunderstands is her core beliefs. And what we have not seen in this series is her faith in Jesus Christ, which was central to every political position she took. I mean, the reason she was interested in the Equal Rights Amendment was not because she saw it as an opportunity, but because she saw it would fundamentally change the American family.
Mm. There's a scene. I want to know what
Yeah.
you have you seen the scene where she goes into the smoke-filled room. This is the 1976 Republican convention, and she wants to negotiate with them. And these are this is the ultimate old boys network. Phyllis walks in, and they want her mailing list. She wants them to take the ERA off the Republican platform. They don't want to deal with her, and they exaggerate, but they show her getting insulted, and there's someone tells an obscene joke. But Cate Blanchett, I think she couldn't help herself, but her acting is so great that you see Phyllis kind of smiling and being gracious and taking stock, and then you see kind of a military genius at work, and she gets a little smile, and it's like the look of a chess master playing simultaneous chess, and he's just going to checkmate everybody in the room. And then the soundtrack comes in with Leslie Gore's "You Don't Own Me, I'm Not Just One of Your Little Toys." And it's sort of like one of the greatest scenes of like female empowerment. Did you see that scene? I'm probably projecting into it.
No, you did, and when they came in with the song, I thought, well, I hear they are giving credit to Phyllis Schlafly as being quite powerful. But I think that my mother learned early on that her power was much better in the heartland and with the grassroots than it ever was trying to play in the Washington, D.C. old boys network. She always kept herself at arm's distance from them and really tried to leverage her power outside of Washington. And now, obviously, that scene is a fictional scene.
Of
Um,
course.
and the reason I know that is because my mother, we now call it the Mike Pence rule, but she never went alone to a place where there was a man who was not her husband without somebody going with her as a chaperone type. I mean, it just was not possible. I was frequently her chaperone when she was not with her husband, because she considered it to be that she had an image and a reputation to maintain, and that you don't get yourself in a compromising situation. And she wouldn't have gotten herself in that kind of compromising situation where they, pushed a glass of scotch on her.
Oh, right. And then they in a way they rigged the timeline. Have you seen the last episode?
Well, I've seen this past one
Oh, but
that
I've
they
seen the
just
whole
showed.
thing because I'm reviewing it, so I got a copy.
Oh, well, they wouldn't let me see
Hey,
the
no
whole thing. They
spoiler alert.
very much said, no, you
Oh,
can't see it.
Okay, well,
well.
excuse me, but I've seen the whole thing. They want to leave her in the kitchen. I mean, spoiler alert, she's left in the kitchen. But they end it in 1980, and so they're claiming that she did all this because she wanted an appointment to the Supreme Court or something in the Reagan administration. And she's back in Alton, Missouri in her kitchen. But the ERA was defeated in 1983. And there was a big fight. So they make it look like the gala celebrating its demise was a year earlier so they could have this defeat. But Phyllis, she knew, when I've read about her, she didn't take politics personally. She knew it was all jockeying, and that in the Reagan administration, she was with the moral majority and the values conservatives, and they were not a priority, certainly in the first Reagan administration. So she wasn't selected, but they made it seem like it was the crushing failure of her life. It was so arbitrary.
Well, and of course there was no crushing failure of her life.
I know. Nothing changed. She went on, and then she had this huge victory when the ERA was not able to pass.
And in 1982, they continued to, try to get support for ERA in the State House in Illinois. And they got so upset, they painted the steps of the Capitol with pig's blood. They were so mad about it.
And chained themselves to the door and went on hunger strikes.
Yes, all of those things.
She was amused by it because they were showing how crazy they really were. Because the members of Congress didn't think the ERA, they thought it was symbolic, kind of a gesture of goodwill. What your mother discovered in her readings was that these feminist activists had something very different in mind. They actually wanted a gender-neutral society with women and men both, for example, in combat.
And let's remember where her information came from. It came from a book written by Ruth Bader Ginsburg in the mid-1970s called Sex Bias in the U.S. Code. And my mother used all the lines in that book as her arguments. And it's funny, she was called fear-mongering, but those were the actual changes in the law that Ruth Bader Ginsburg was supporting.
Interesting. It's really, everything is so fascinating to me. And just hearing this story, Hollywood is so frustrating to me because on the one hand, as Christina was saying, these prestige television shows, I mean, the talent on every level of the way it looks, the way the writing is, the talent of the actresses and actors is so high. But
I really felt sorry for Betty Friedan. I thought they kind of, they really, she comes across as
I thought that was Betty Friedan's most glamorous portrayal ever.
She never looked better.
Really easy. Yeah, you never saw her husband. I think they're suggesting her alcoholism with the drinking, but I don't know where it goes. I was like, I mean, it's a wonderful portrayal of a person that's very like Betty Friedan, but Betty Friedan was just, she didn't pull a punch, and they kind of indicated there that it was, that her book had so revolutionized people, but then they were on to the next stage of the revolution and how painful that was for her. So that I think was true.
Yeah, she looks like a sad sack.
Yes.
But I think Gloria Steinem is, first of all, she's just like this the whole time. And so,
she's the worst. She's the worst.
And then there's a scene where she says, I guess it's Jill Ruckelshaus, the Republican wife, but pro-ERA, says, we don't want people to think we're against housewives. And then this sullen ACLU lawyer, feminist, Brenda, says, we are against the housewives. And then Gloria says, revolutions are hard, Who wanted their revolution? And this was in 1975.
I thought the Gloria Steinem character, by the way, was eerily like her, so intoxicatingly attractive and cool and the popular girl. But Anne, let's also not pretend that there wasn't a lot of, sexism in general back then. Certainly sexism within the Republican Party that we're seeing right now.
And the Democratic Party.
Yeah, but it's especially true, I would say, right now. and you broke with your mother. She died in 2016, I think.
Mhm.
And you broke with your mother because she came out, she supported Trump. Her book was published posthumously. Uh, I'm just looking for the name of it, but it was a pro-Trump book that
The
came out.
conservative case for Trump.
The conservative case for Trump,
Yeah.
a day
The
after.
title.
And as you say, she was it makes total sense that she was driven by her Catholicism and her beliefs, and in some ways she brought Catholics to the Republican Party away from the Democrats, after JFK. And but yet in the end she came out for Donald Trump. Tell us what you think of that.
Well, first of all, what happened with Eagle Forum is that we had to fire a short-term president who had proved to be a disaster and was undermining and trying to destroy the organization. And the big kerfuffle in 2016 had nothing to do with who was going to be president and everything to do with the management of Eagle Forum. And I'm proud to stand with the female volunteers who had worked with my mother for decades in ousting this bad president and reestablishing the organization on the truths of the organization. My mother, my mother liked winners, and she saw in Donald Trump somebody who would win, and that's why she supported him, was because she wanted, she was tired of candidates who would lose or kowtow to the Democratic Party.
But you apparently broke with that. Were you a supporter of Donald Trump?
Well, I voted for Donald Trump in November of 2016.
Can I ask you about something? I saw, I mentioned before this debate that we see with your mother just being destroyed by this ACLU lawyer, Brenda. But I saw an actual tape of the debate. It was on the Tom Snyder Tomorrow Show, and it was the lawyer, the feminist lawyer, that was destroyed. So and I heard that this Davi Waller quoted, who said, "Well, I did take liberties with the text, but only private conversation." She said, "Every event and debate is real." No, she made up this debate and she reversed the roles and made it look like your mother was the loser.
Well, she had to do that because the previous episode showed Betty Friedan losing her cool to
But even that
Phyllis
was made
Schalfly.
up. She made it look like your mother insulted Betty. Now,
Yes.
your mother, I've seen her debate. She did not use ad hominems. She was always about the argument, the point, the legal. She didn't. They made that up. They made it look like she drove Betty to overreact and say she wanted to burn her at the. What did Betty say? Betty Friedan said she wanted to burn your mother at the stake. But they make it look like that was because your mother was persecuting her, talking about.
Well, because they show this idea that her husband bullies her, and then she turns around and bullies her daughter, and then she bullies Betty Friedan, and the pornographic publisher is bullying Gloria Steinem. And so it's a whole episode about the effects of bullying and how, and trying to make my mother seem like she was a bully.
Now, tell us about Eleanor. Did she live in your house and take care of you and do all the work?
No.
This was
was Eleanor.
Eleanor was my father's sister.
Oh, right.
And Eleanor was a force of her own.
That's
and
what I've heard.
If you, when Eleanor and Phyllis were in the room together, Eleanor dominated. She ran her own organization for 50 years. It was a conservative Catholic organization. And she had I mean, the last thing she would ever need is social help from her brother in the small town, because my Aunt Eleanor had a large house and a glamorous social life all of her own.
Huh.
They invent this character and make her look like she lives with the Schlaflys and does all the work, raises all the children. And then they show Phyllis being cruel to her, disinviting her to Thanksgiving, and never thanking her. It was all BS.
I haven't seen that episode yet.
Oh my God. It gets worse. Whatever you've seen now, it gets worse. They get angrier and angrier. I think because they realized maybe they'd been too nice or something. and so they're making amends by, because I've heard people have said to her in interviews, well, you kind of make her look too human and normal. She says, well, wait till you get to the end. So somehow they go full, demonization
Well,
in
they have to.
episodes.
It's Hollywood. That's what I wasn't very articulate when I said it, but if you had pitched that story, if they had pitched that story, like we have learned that Phyllis Schalfly was a very, very admirable woman, and a real intellectual, someone who engaged with the nuclear debates before she began this cause, and that she was really inspired by this kind of Christianity and this idea of what was best for the American family. Can we make that documentary? They would say, leave immediately. Just get out of here. They would say, well, and then you say, well, I have these actresses attached, but okay, but Phyllis is going to be the bad guy, right? And it's just, Hollywood would never, ever, ever deploy those levels of resources, of actors, etc., to tell a story that way. And it has consequences, because the culture sees that the culture that sort of would agree with Phyllis Schlafly, that the children and grandchildren now, they see that the media is against them. They see that their values aren't portrayed with respect on, high profile shows, and that they're even mocked. And that's why we have this divide.
Here's the thing. She ran an organization of women. And if she were a power mad, controlling, bullying kind of leader, why did women stick with her? Why were they so loyal to her? Why do they honor and praise her today? It was because she was an encourager, she was a role model, and she mentored women. And that's the story that they've missed in this show.
I think everybody on this panel has been called some version of a female Uncle Tom. That came out in the show about your mom, and Caitlin, Christina, when you advocate for a non-ideological view, you get called that. What do you say to that? And is that tell us about the issues for women now that you are dealing with. We seem to be in a hamster wheel of just these same things coming back. Everything your mother said is a version of what we have been saying, and I'm sure now what you're saying.
Well, I do think the producers are correct in that a lot of the issues that were discussed in the 70s are still current today, and that's why this show has had a lot of viewership because of that. But the left always talks about diversity, but it is superficial diversity. They've never been interested in diversity of opinions, and their response to opinions they don't like is usually to slander or to slur. But I think we see this in the Me Too movement, which has been strictly as a political tool as opposed to a true examination of sexual harassment or sexism. I mean, you've asked about, yes, wasn't there sexism? Well, of course there was sexism, because men and women are fundamentally different, and there is always going to be an undercurrent of the differences between men and women, and you can try to legislate and pretend they don't exist, but they're there. And are there plenty of men who behave badly? Yes, and but that doesn't mean that we don't have opportunity to present ourselves and to do well. And the arc of my mother's career over 70 years really showed that if you have a positive attitude and ignore the sexism, rather than playing the victim card, you can get ahead and have a success rather than whining and moaning.
Oh, by the way, remembered a scene in the movie. This violent man comes out of nowhere. This really happened, and hits your mother in the face with a pie, but so hard that it scratched her cornea. She had to wear an eye patch.
God.
But what does she do? She kind of pushes the whipped cream away and says, well, thank goodness it wasn't a cherry pie. It would have stained my dress. And now
And then she made her speech.
and then she gave her speech.
That picture was on the front page of the newspaper across the country when that happened, when she got hit in the face with a pie. And for a lot of people on the left, it was like, well, why didn't you hit her harder? I mean, there is a double standard when it comes to conservative women.
Oh, well, Florence Kennedy was on a radio show in Miami and said, why doesn't somebody punch her in the face?
Mm-hmm.
And Florence Kennedy is treated like the heroine of the series, but, she was complicated and obviously had a violent, imagination.
And one of the things, my eldest daughter, who's 28, watched the first episode, and after I watched the first episode, I said, God, it's so funny. I mean, she's saying all the things that we're trying to say, and it all made perfect.
Okay, never mind.
She always forgets to silence.
No, I don't.
All of it made sort of perfect sense to me. And my daughter was like, it was like she was speaking Chinese, like, oh my God, I can't in any way identify with this woman. And look, to be stressed, she grew up with me, so she's had a lot of these same messages, but filtered through a modern vocabulary. So but it just seems, I'm sure, freakishly historical and women in combat, blah, blah, blah. But what do you think? I mean, as head of now a women's organization, what do we tell our daughters? Do you have daughters? What is the message you would convey to them now?
Well, I think it does sort of seem like a historical set piece, but a lot of the issues are still current today. And in the New York Times today, they have a full page article bemoaning that the people under the age of 25 are pro-life and anti-abortion. And so it took generations to work through some of these issues, but you now see the result of it. And the New York Times was stunned that these young people who seemed like they could be liberal on so many other issues like climate change would continue to support the Republicans because they were not the Democrats who they saw as virulently pro-abortion. And explaining these issues on the conservative side is never in a soundbite. It always has to be a long discussion, because the soundbite our issues can't be explained in a glib way. We have to dive in and say, if we treat men and women interchangeable in every situation, women get harmed, and then go through the reasons why women get harmed and why we should celebrate differences between men and women and not try to pretend that they don't exist because of the harms that happen to women. I mean, certainly when I was young and in my 20s, I thought I was as invincible as anybody else I met. And then I realized, well, there are problems with that. And there are ways that I can get myself in trouble if I think of myself as invincible. But at 28, like your daughter, I certainly thought, well, anything a man can do, I can do better. I mean, that was always the feeling at that point, at that age.
I grew up thinking that, very honestly, and I like write lots of things about boys and men and how they're mistreated in the culture, but my honest belief was that they were not as bright as we were in school. I thought like, oh, they have these things they do, but I thought they had a less intelligence. I don't know why I would think that, but I really thought the girls
they were the weaker students. Boys really didn't show up in the advanced classes until advanced math classes, and then they were there.
10 minutes.
We have today where college graduation rates are 60% female. So you do see women much more academically studious and more motivated to get a college degree today. And that causes ripples throughout our culture because of that. But there's no question that academically, we can always compete head to head with men and boys. But there are other physical differences that are quite that make quite a bit of difference.
Yeah, consequential.
Well,
did your mother ever jump in the pool with you?
No.
And force you to?
Oh, that was so weird.
It was weird.
Well, that was the idea of showing her as a bully to lesser women, don't you think?
Tell them about the scene and then what really happened. Did your mom give you swimming lessons?
We did have a pool in our backyard, and I remember always swimming, and I don't remember us any time being afraid of going into the water and swimming. I think I swam from an early age.
So in this show, I guess they show you kind of crying in your room or something, and the bad Eleanor is protecting you in complete fantasy, a complete fabrication. And then your mother says, "What are you doing, Eleanor? She's got to, go back in." And she grabs you, and you're terrified. She jumps in the pool, and you
Well, she
almost
puts her own suit on too, though, doesn't she?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
her like swimming cap, and it was like a mommy dearest,
it
mother
was a
dearest
mommy
moment.
dearest moment.
Well, here's the thing. They're showing her as a strict, almost terrorizing parent. And the truth be told, my mother was a coddler. I think she was a little too soft as a parent and too easy. I mean, if I wanted to get my way, it was much easier to go to my mother.
Oh my goodness. I know, I'm not surprised.
Well, one of the things that does come out in the movie that her eldest son, your brother, was gay. Is gay. Sorry, it's not a past tense thing. Forgive me. And she was one of the reasons she was against the ERA was because she felt, correctly it would lead to same-sex marriage, and we got that. That came about regardless. How has your brother reacted to this, and what would you say about her views vis-a-vis her son and the gay rights issues?
Well, I go back to her deep Catholic faith. My mother did not believe in sex outside the married sex of husbands and wives. And so was she, she didn't want her child to have another kind of life. But as she always said, you can't make your adult children do something, if they're going to do what they want to do. But that did not diminish her love for her son. But it certainly, did she always want him not to be? And did she want him to find happiness in a married life with a female? Of course she did, because that was her core life belief.
Were they reconciled when she died?
They were never
They were
irreconciled.
never not reconciled. She loved him.
She loved all of
And
her
he loved
children.
her. She loved all of them. I mean, she was a loving mother. They tried to make her mommy dearest, but I never.
Tell us, Anne, how that worked. Were you there when he sort of came out? Like, how did that happen? How do you come out to a mom who is has those beliefs?
Well, what actually happened was in 1992, my mother had successively, in multiple Republican National Conventions, made an effort to change the party platform to be pro-life and to remove abortion from the Republican Party platform. So this effort to do this took multiple years because there were quite a lot of forces against her, the most prominent of which was the wife of Roger Stone, who I understand makes a cameo at the end, which is kind of strange because my mother battled the Stones over this very issue of abortion in the Republican Party platform.
I remember her. I met her. We knew her. Do you remember?
Anne Stone.
Anne Stone. I met her.
Yes. And so this was a hot battle, and 1992 was the hottest of them all, and where my mother finally won the language that she wanted, which is still in there today. And right after that, in retaliation,
He was outed.
He was outed.
By
Yes,
advocate.
and it was done in retaliation. It was not my brother's choice.
Right, it was my magazine, right? Queer.
The Advocate. That was brutal.
And so once it comes out, there it is. So that's what you have to deal with. And my mother gave interviews on it at the time and then said, I don't ever want to talk about it again, which is very much like my mother.
Can I ask you one thing? Wouldn't a little part of your mother sort of enjoy this series? And I ask that because I saw, when I met her, she was much older, but even to the last minute, she was elegant. She was dressed to the nines. She was, let's say she was a little vain. I mean, she enjoyed being an attractive woman. And
yes, and I think she was more than a little vain.
I think so too. And she she wasn't a prude.
No.
So in the opening scene, we see her in a bikini. It's some kind of
But
nightmarish.
she wouldn't have done that
She would never have done that. But
because I wasn't even allowed to wear a bikini.
I know, no one ever saw your mother in a bikini. It was a complete fabrication. But there she is in some like imagined fashion, whatever, I don't know, trying to raise money for the Republican Party and strolling around. She looks pretty good. So part of her would probably like, okay, fine. I don't think she would
I
have.
think she would have relished the attention that a beautiful actress was playing her. There's no doubt
I
about that.
agree.
Famous actress. Um, one of the encounters I had with her was in the Republican convention of 1988. I had just gotten married, and Caitlin, Christina will appreciate this is David's idea of a fun,
Anniversary.
no, like almost honeymoon trip to go to the Republican
But
convention.
it was in New Orleans. That's a fun place to
That
go.
was fun. That was fun. But I remember she was such a huge presence. And George George Bush Sr. had appointed Dan Quayle, the big reveal of who his running mate was going to be. And I remember going to, I guess, the Eagle Forum reception of one of the evenings. And I didn't really know who she was, but she just had such a spectacular presence. She was on a kind of staircase.
It was at the New Orleans Art Museum, and
oh, okay, you remember? You were there.
I was there, and what the funny thing was is that she was standing there. The portrait behind her was of Marie Antoinette.
No.
So right. Oh, and so we were part of a receiving line, and we were with a very good friend of ours who's from Texas and involved in Republican circles. So she recognized him right away, and of course he's at that time and remains a very handsome man, and she kind of got all kittenish with him and said and he said, well, what do you think of the choice of Dan Quayle? And she said, well, he's a very handsome kind of manly man, and if the men vote for him, then it'll appeal to men, and then if the men vote for him, of course the women will follow. And I was just like, I was so gobsmacked and yet impressed with her.
I had the same thing. I was on a talk show. I'd written my book, Who Stole Feminism? And she has a talk show or something, on the radio talk show. And I go on, and immediately, and I'm showing that Gloria Steinem just mangled the facts, and she claimed completely hysterically that 150,000 girls are dying every year of anorexia nervosa, this eating disorder that, in desperate efforts to please the patriarchy, that women are dying at the rate of 150,000 a year. And I showed that this came out of, it was just one of many, many hysterical exaggerations. And then a young woman calls up and said, well, maybe she got the statistics wrong, but all my friends have eating disorders. They all have bulimia or anorexia. And I'm then thinking, oh God, what am I? And then your mother says, well, I think you should find new friends.
The witty quip was part of her techniques. There's no doubt about it.
She has a great presence of mind. Last question before we let you go. And again, we're so happy to have you here and hear this backstory. What would you, I asked, and I'm sorry I don't already know this, but do you have daughters?
I do not.
Okay. So if you did, let's just pretend, what would you tell your daughters? What is the message of the Eagle Forum today to young women? What would you say?
I think it is a message of empowerment, that you can succeed, because I have always found that the message of feminism, and I think we see this in this show, that Gloria Steinem talks about it being a half-life. And I think that holds women back. I do think that we can do anything we want to do if we set our mind to it, and the world is open to us. But what my mother always said is, you can do it, but you can't do it all at the same time. And she always encouraged women to plan their lives so that they could partake of all of it and not just some of it. And of course, planning your life means getting a successful marriage and family as being a primary part of it, because I think both men and women do better and succeed better when they're in a successful marriage, but particularly women, that the satisfaction that you get from a wonderful marriage is worth more than so many other things, and that you need to value it and put an emphasis on it and work for it. And what we have today are so many women who are unmarried, young men and women who have not attached themselves, and I think they're missing out on a crucial part of life. Now, in terms of policy issues, this is fighting against the culture, because the culture almost celebrates the independence and celebrates the self-fulfillment as opposed to the fulfillment you get in a marriage, and working towards promoting a marriage and family culture is very hard in current pop culture, because that's not what we're seeing. But in the end, it's what we all crave and what we all want. So we hope to always encourage and provide after all, Christina, you just said, get better friends. If you surround yourself with Debbie Downers, you will be a Debbie Downer.
I know, but I think it's not so much there are so many Debbie Downers, but there are so many confused women and men, by the way.
Yes.
That we've lost the language. We don't know what to do or say. But
there's no doubt about that.
And thank you so much for joining us, and loved hearing your commentary and view of the other side.
Wonderful.
So thank you, and
I really appreciate you having me on.
Well, we loved having you, and we'll have you again. We want to hear what you're.
Yes.
If we ever get out of this pandemic.
Out of our living rooms and bedrooms.
Come to that cesspool of Washington.
Is that an unmade bed back there?
No, I made it. Actually, my husband made it. And in all honesty, he said you should make the bed.
Doesn't look like he did a very good job, but no, I'm no judgment.
Well, that's because I have a lot of clothes piled on top of it.
Oh.
So your bed is your closet. Oh.
There we go.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Ann.
My pleasure.